Saturn's rings are dying. A rock barely the size of a city is helping to carve them apart. For centuries, Saturn's rings looked eternal. That belief is wrong. The rings are slowly collapsing into Saturn itself. They have maybe 100 million years left, possibly less. He inside them is a tiny moon, only 8 kilometers wide, carving directly through the ice like a blade. Its name is Daphnis. Galileo first saw them in 1610. His telescope was too weak to resolve them properly. He thought Saturn had 2 large companions. He described them as ears. 45 years later, Christian Huygens figured out the truth. Those ears were actually a flat spinning disk of material. From that point on, Saturn's rings became the most photographed feature in planetary astronomy. Trillions of chunks of water ice, ranging in size from dust grains to house-sized boulders, all orbiting Saturn at enormous speeds. The rings stretch across nearly 280,000 kilometers, more than 2/3 the distance from Earth to our moon. But vertically, they are almost nothing. In most places, the rings are only about 10 meters thick. Imagine a sheet of paper the size of the continental United States. That is the proportion we are dealing with. Flat beyond comprehension. For decades, the assumption was that these rings were as old as Saturn itself, around 4.5 billion years, a relic left over from the formation of the solar system. Scientists had no reason to question it, until Cassini showed up. The Cassini spacecraft arrived at Saturn in 2004. It spent 13 years studying the planet, its rings, and its moons in unprecedented detail. In its final months in 2017, flight controllers sent it on what they called the Grand Finale .22 daring dives through the gap between Saturn and its innermost rings. No spacecraft had ever flown there. The data Cassini sent back rewrote the entire story. The rings are young, shockingly young. Current estimates place their age at somewhere between 100 million and 400 million years. That sounds like a long time, but in cosmic terms, it means the rings are a recent addition. Dinosaurs were walking Earth when the rings were forming. Some models suggest Saturn did not have rings at all when early mammals were evolving. These rings were not here when the planet was born. They showed up later. And they are already on their way out. Cassini measured the ring rain directly. Water molecules from the rings pulled down into Saturn's atmosphere along invisible lines of the planet's magnetic field. The rate of loss is roughly equivalent to draining an Olympic-sized swimming pool from the rings every 30 minutes, 24 hours a day, every day, for the next 100 million years or more until there is nothing left. This is the backdrop. The rings are a fading masterpiece. Saturn itself is the main executioner. But inside those rings, there is a handful of tiny moons that act as accomplices. They carve, they sculpt, they stir up the material, and the most dramatic of them is Daphnis. Cassini caught it in the act over and over again. Daphnis was not discovered until May 2005. It was not spotted from Earth. No ground-based telescope was ever going to see it. It was found by combing through images from the Cassini spacecraft. Frame by frame, a tiny bright dot moving inside a gap in Saturn's A-ring. The dot was about 8 kilometers long, not round, elongated, football-shaped, with a faint ridge circling its equator where ring material has settled onto it over millions of years. It had the approximate dimensions of a small city. Manhattan is larger, and yet this small, insignificant, almost laughably tiny rock is responsible for one of the strangest visible features in the entire ring system. Look at high-resolution images of Saturn's A-ring. You will see a thin, dark line running through it, a crack in the bright band about 42 kilometers wide. That line is called the Keeler Gap, named in honor of the 19th-century American astronomer James Keeler. Though Keeler himself never saw it. He died in 1900. The gap was discovered 80 years later by the Voyager spacecraft during its 1981 flyby of Saturn. And once astronomers noticed it, they noticed something else. The inner and outer edges of the gap were not smooth. They had tiny, wavy disturbances. Something was pulling on the ring material, something inside the gap. They just could not see what. Cassini found it. Daphnis sits inside the Keeler Gap. It orbits right in the middle of that 42-kilometer clearing. Everywhere it goes, it keeps the gap clean. Any ring particle that drifts into the gap gets grabbed by Daphnis' tiny gravity. Flung aside, dead to the edge of the surrounding rings. The moon is a miniature snow plow endlessly shoving ice out of its own path. If that was all Daphnis did, it would still be remarkable. A rock measuring only 8 kilometers from tip to tip, maintaining a gap wider than Rhode Island just by showing up. But Daphnis does something else. Something so visually striking that when Cassini first photographed it in high resolution, the images became some of the most shared pictures of the entire mission. Daphnis' orbit is not perfectly circular. It is slightly elliptical, and more importantly, it is slightly inclined by only a fraction of a degree. Daphnis bobs up and down relative to the ring plane as it orbits Saturn. Not much, just a small vertical wobble. But that wobble is enough. As Daphnis swings past the inner edge of the gap, its gravity tugs on the ring particles closest to it. Those particles get pulled inward and upward. Then Daphnis moves on and the particles freed from the tug spring back toward their original path. But the spring back is not instant. They overshoot, they oscillate, they form a wave. Then the next time Daphnis comes around, it tugs again. Another wave forms, and another, and another. The result is a scalloped rippling edge on both sides of the Keeler Gap, running for tens of thousands of kilometers in every direction, waves up to 1.5 kilometers tall, raised out of a ring that is normally only 10 meters thick, on a surface flatter than paper. One tiny moon is raising ice mountains 1.5 kilometers high just by existing. Those mountains are made of nothing but ring particles caught mid-bounce, still ringing from a gravitational tap that happened minutes or hours ago. You are looking at gravity frozen in motion, a record of every time Daphnis swung by, a wake. Cassini photographed this wake in 2017 during its closest ever flyby of Daphnis. The image is almost unreal. A small bright boulder leading 2 fishtailing walls of ice that stretch off to either side, like a speedboat crossing a mirror lake. Except the lake is a ring of ice thousands of kilometers wide, and the speedboat is a moon. This is where Daphnis earns its reputation. Other Saturnian moons destabilize the rings from far away, giving tiny gravitational nudges at precise intervals. Daphnis does it up close, inside the rings directly every orbit. You can see exactly where it has been because it leaves a trail of disruption the length of a continent. And it never stops. Daphnis orbits Saturn once every 14 hours. That means it laps the ring material in the Keeler Gap thousands of times per year, millions of times per 1,000 years, billions of times per million years. And every single lap, it shoves more ice around, nudges more particles into new orbits, disrupts more of the careful arrangement that makes Saturn's rings look so orderly from a distance. Each time Daphnis flings a ring particle into a new orbit, it puts that particle at risk. Some of those displaced particles end up on paths that collide with other particles. Some end up drifting inward, where Saturn's gravity can eventually pull them all the way down into the planet. Some get knocked out of the ring plane entirely. Daphnis is not directly dropping ring material into Saturn, but Daphnis is accelerating the chaos, adding energy, keeping the system from settling into the kind of stable configuration that could last longer. And Daphnis is not alone in this. Saturn's ring system contains at least a dozen of these small embedded moons and moonlets, each one carving its own gap, each one making its own smaller waves, each one kicking particles around. Pan about 34 kilometers across sits inside the Enki Gap. Atlas hugs the outer edge of the A-ring. Prometheus and Pandora braid the F-ring like fingers pulling at a spool of thread. Together they are a committee of demolition workers. And Daphnis is the one caught most dramatically on camera. You are hovering just above Saturn's rings in a spacecraft. Below you, a flat plane of ice stretches to the horizon, glittering in pale yellow sunlight. You see a long, narrow scar cut into that plane, the Keeler Gap. It is dark and sharp, perfectly clean. as if someone took a knife and drew a line through the whole ring system. You scan the gap. At first, you see nothing. Then a small white dot appears in the distance, moving fast. It races toward you. As it passes, the edges of the gap rise up on both sides slowly, like ocean swells forming in the wake of a boat. You watch those swells climb. They reach a kilometer high, maybe more. Then they begin to fall back. The dot keeps moving. It shrinks in the distance, but the waves it made stay visible, stretched across the ice for what looks like forever. That is what Cassini saw. That is what Daphnis does every orbit, every day, every year, without pause. Daphnis is not a primordial moon. The current leading theory is that it formed directly from ring material. Ice and rock clumped together inside the disk, gathered enough gravity to hold itself in a stable shape, became an independent object. A moon born from the very material it now destroys. That makes Daphnis something unusual. It is both child and executioner of the rings. It came from them. It lives inside them. And every time it completes another orbit, it accelerates their end. Saturn's ring system is not just a collection of ice particles. It is a dynamic, evolving, self-consuming environment. Moons are forming inside it. Moons are being destroyed by it. Material is falling into Saturn. New material occasionally gets added by passing comets. The rings we see today are a snapshot of one particular moment in a long, complicated process. It began somewhere around the time of the last dinosaurs, and will end somewhere inside the next 100 million years. One theory gaining traction proposed in 2022 by researchers at MIT is called the chrysalis hypothesis. It suggests that Saturn once had another large moon named Chrysalis, which became unstable about 100 to 200 million years ago. The moon drifted too close to Saturn. The planet's gravity tore it apart. The debris settled into a flat disk. Those are the rings we see today. If that is correct, then the rings are literally the shredded corpse of a dead moon. And Daphnis, born from the wreckage, is still carving patterns in the grave. The graveyard is not peaceful. Saturn's rings, for all their quiet beauty in photographs, are one of the most violent places in the solar system at the microscale. Ice chunks collide at speeds of meters per second. Particles smash into each other, shatter, recombine, shatter again. Electrostatic forces charge dust grains and lift them above the plane. Meteoroids from outside the system plunge through the rings regularly, sending sprays of debris everywhere. And through all of this, Daphnis plows forward, making its waves, clearing its gap, stirring the chaos that the rings are made of. If you could somehow survive inside the Keeler Gap and watch Daphnis pass overhead, you would see a dim, lumpy shape glide silently by, backlit by Saturn's enormous cloud bands. Then the walls of the gap would rise, slowly at first, then faster. The peaks would form a kilometer above your head and drift past in slow motion before settling back into place, waiting for the next pass. It is one of the few places in the solar system where gravity does something you can see with your eyes. 8 kilometers of rock and ice, Manhattan alone in an ocean of frozen particles, shoving them aside with every lap. The rings have maybe 100 million years left. By the end of that window, almost everything we currently see will be gone, drained into Saturn. We happen to live at the exact moment in its history when all of this is visible. If humans had evolved a few 100 million years earlier or later, Saturn would be a pale yellow globe with no rings worth mentioning, the ringed planet on every textbook cover, every child's drawing, every planet emoji would not exist. We got lucky. A moon broke apart near a gas giant, left behind a dazzling disk of ice. And inside that disk, a tiny rock carved out a 42-kilometer gap and started making waves. Waves that nobody is around to watch, in a gap that nobody asked it to cut. Daphnis is carving the rings apart.